Western civilization. It's been around for a while, but suddenly everybody is talking about it.
I promised myself I wasn't going to react to these videos anymore, but this one was so crazy that I had to, and it had unique ideas compared to the other ones. It had the same ideas, but it had some unique ideas.
Some are anxious to save it. Others are happy to see it go. But what exactly is Western civilization? Is it the great cathedrals of Europe or the Nazi concentration camps?
Or the third option, both.
Is it the freedoms secured in the U.S. Constitution or chattel slavery?
Again, both freedom and bondage.
Life-saving medicines or poison gas? The left likes to focus on the bad: genocide, slavery, environmental destruction. But those have been present in every civilization from time immemorial.
Again, terrible defense, but worse than that is that it's not even true. Every civilization in history did not commit a genocide. I could give you that slavery is more common in history, but genocide, usually people after a war would either enslave people or keep them around. Genocide? I don't think so.
The positives are unique to the West.
Of course they are.
Religious tolerance, abolition of slavery, universal human rights, the development of the scientific method. These are accomplishments of a scope and scale that only the West can claim.
Not only is that not true, but there are civilizations that went way further with this than the West ever did. For example, under Ashoka, there was an abolition of slavery, there was religious tolerance, and there was universal human rights and universal life rights, animal rights. That's why some things like not allowing people to eat cows is like a thing in India. It's a very peaceful place, at least historically. The development of the scientific method, the development of scientific method again started with the Muslims. They invented the scientific method. So the Western world being the creator of these positives it's not real.
These aren't the only achievements that make the West special and uniquely successful. As Western thought evolved, it secured the rights of women and minorities, lifted billions of people out of poverty, and invented most of the modern world.
So let's address the woman part. First of all, Africa didn't need to overturn most of their rules on women because they're not as sexist as the West ever was, where the West put too much emphasis on sexism. So Africa would be exempt from that claim. Also, the minority thing. Well, who are those minorities? You say that they released the minorities. Well, in Africa, we didn't need to do nothing like that because we didn't have scientific racism and racism in general in that deeper sense as you guys did it until it was brought to us by the foreigners, the Westerners. The last thing he said is that the Western world invented most of the modern world. No, the Westerners stole most of their inventions for the modern world. Of course, there are some inventions that were invented by the West, but most of the time they had captive nations who couldn't innovate at the time. So it's kind of an unfair comparison because these people are thinking about freeing themselves from bondage.
Progress hasn't been a straight line, of course, but the arc of history is clear. The obvious proof is that the world is overwhelmingly Western.
Well, a lot of that arc is forced. A lot of that arc is forced because of economical pressures, because of scientific pressures, because of colonization, historic colonization, and now they have to cling on to the one thing they understand, which is what came after colonization, because they lost their cultures. To be honest, only a Westerner would think it's a good thing that everybody is dressing the same as Westerners and that they do not have completely unique cultures that can represent a spectrum around the world as they used to, allowing people to come up with completely unique ideas that have nothing to do with other parts of the world, so we don't all tackle the same problems at the same time.
And, with few exceptions, those parts of the world that aren't aspire to be. Why? Why has Western civilization been so successful?
Simply put, it's all the reasons that he wanted to downplay earlier: the slavery, the genocide, the racism, the colonization. All of that played a huge role in why the West is quote unquote so successful. Its success is bathed in blood, it's paved in blood.
There are many reasons, but the best place to start is with the teachings and philosophies that emerged from two ancient cities, Jerusalem and Athens.
And no, Jerusalem is not in the West. That is a terrible start. That is one of the worst starts I've ever seen. Jerusalem is 100% Eastern, no matter how you slice it. Its history has nothing to do with the West up until, the Roman periods and the Greeks and all those people. But before then, it was an Eastern civilization connected to Africa and Egypt.
Jerusalem represents religious revelation as manifested in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the beliefs that a good God created an ordered universe and that this God demands moral behavior from his paramount creation, man.
First of all, the idea that a good God is supposed to demand goodness from his people is consistent all over the world. Now, I wonder if he's going to mention the atrocities that Christians went and did all over the world, including the genocides. Of course, he says Christian Judeo, right? So he's going to include the Judeo and the terrible things they did at one point, the Christians and the terrible things they did, and the Muslims and the terrible things they've done, including stuff like slavery. So, if this is where he's starting, I hope that he balances it out by showing the reality of what these religions that have a quote unquote good God did. And I'm not saying bullying them. There's a lot of religions around the world that claim to be good, like Hinduism or Buddhism or the ancient Egyptian mythology. That thing where it says, I did not steal, I did not rob, I did not cast someone's name, that's from ancient Egypt. That's like 3,000 years before it happened in Israel. I do understand why, though, he wants to make Israel part of the Western world, even though it's not.
The other city, Athens, represents reason and logic as expressed by the great Greek thinkers, Plato and Aristotle, and many others.
Again, a lot of the works made by the Greeks, they went and gave credit to the ancient Egyptians, saying, even calling Egypt one of their civilizers. In fact, let's go even further than that. The Greek alphabet comes from ancient Egyptian writing system, converted into Proto-Sinaitic, converted into Phoenician, converted into Greek. It's simple. It's not that hard of a process. The Greeks who are writing all these crazy things would be nowhere without these neighbors, these Eastern neighbors.
These two ways of thinking, revelation and reason, live in constant tension.
Revelation and reason only live in constant tension with the Judeo religions, because somewhere in the Judeo religions there are multiple excuses for why you can't engage in earthly things, and reason is one of those earthly things. But the Greeks were very religious, and they still came up with crazy ideas that were be considered reasonable. The people in India were religious, and they came up with a whole bunch of things that are reasonable, and the ancient Egyptians came up with reasonable philosophies as well. So I don't even the Muslims. I don't understand why you don't understand why the people who are part of this religion, who are part of the Judeo religion, are making this tension. So these the point you're making, it's fighting against itself, even in your own speech. You literally just said that they have a hard time balancing with each other, even in the Western world.
Judeo-Christian religion posits that there are certain fundamental truths handed down to us by a transcendent being. We didn't invent these truths. We received them from God.
That's your interpretation of the Bible. My interpretation of the Bible is that the Garden of Eden was to keep human beings naive, and then they ate from the Garden of Eden, and that made them toil the earth, that made them expand and get out of the Garden of Eden, and that made them become who they basically were, this civilization that had to strive for themselves with a disconnect from God, meaning that they didn't get truths from God like they used to, but instead they were getting truths from themselves. I think not understanding that is very weak religious interpretation, especially if you know that a truth was revealed to them. They realized that they were naked. They realized all kinds of things that God did not bestow upon them. In fact, it was the serpent that showed them. If it was not for the serpent, then the direction of the human being would have never gotten to this place. Oh, here's another one. The Tower of Babel. When the people were trying to figure out how to get to heaven, God made them have different languages so that they can't figure that out. It's easy to say that there's just truths that are bestowed by God, but that's just a interpretation of the Bible. The things that he is calling truths are not truths, they're laws. Laws are not neither true nor false. They're just edicts.
The rules he lays down for us are vital for building a functioning, moral civilization and for leading a happy life.
First of all, God does not care about civilization. He cares about morality, but that's about it. The idea that he put, but I knew that he was talking about laws. Did I not say that earlier? He is talking about laws. Laws are neither truth nor fiction. They're just moralities, and we have changed those moralities several times.
Greek thinking posits that we only know truth by what we observe, test, and measure.
Some Greek thinking believes that that's true, but there was religious Greek people who believed in stuff that had nothing to do with that. There's also the seven deadly sins that had to do with the Greeks, and they also had morality. They had a moral code. They weren't void of morality. They didn't say, "Hey, test, measure, and if we measure, then that's the morality." A lot of their moralities were not based off of measuring anything. They were based off of just thinking and basing it off of their historical, traditional, cultural, and religious interpretations.
It is not faith but fact that drives our understanding and exploration of the universe.
This is historical revisionism. The Greeks had a lot of faith in a lot of things. I mean, that's why there's a reason why the planets are named after gods. And even though some people try to bring reason to what they were doing, they still believed that there were gods up there.
Western civilization, and only Western civilization, has found a way to balance both religious belief and human reason.
Nope, the Islamic civilization found that out long time ago. Not to mention the Hindus did that long time ago. Literally all your numbers are Hindu Arabic numbers, the numerals that were used. The Greek and Roman numbers, which came from ancient Egyptian numbers because they were written in alphabets, they were not good enough for utilization, and so they had to come from Indian Arabic numerals because they were better and more well reasoned for conclusions, inventing the number zero through what? Reason.
Here's how the balance works. The Judeo-Christian tradition teaches that God created an ordered universe and that we have an obligation to try to make the world better.
The Judeo-Christian religions do talk about making the world better in some places, but for the most part, it's about having a relationship with God. That's what it really is about. It's got nothing to do with making the world a better place. In fact, it kind of has a give up mentality on the world, that the world is just a sinful place, and that the most important thing is to try and get into heaven.
This offers us purpose and suggests that history moves forward. Most pagan religions taught the opposite, that the universe is illogical and random, and that history is cyclical.
Citation needed?
History just endlessly repeats itself, in which case, why bother to innovate or create anything new?
Is this fun? Is it fun to just make stuff up randomly? Why bother make anything new? Is there any civilization in history that you can find that never created anything new because they had such a give up mentality that the world is cyclical, and why bother? Why create anything new? Do you know about Egypt? Do you know how many things they invented, like glass? Do you know how many things the Arabs invented? Do you know how many things the Hindus invented? Do you know how many things people from all over the world invented? When I say Arabs, by the way, I mean Mesopotamians and all these other people who were pagan, Canaanites. You know how many pagans have invented stuff? Mesoamerica? Do those places look like they gave up?
Second, Judeo-Christian tradition teaches that every human is created in the image of God. That is, each individual's life is infinitely valuable.
The Bible does teach that every human being is made in the image of God, but that does not mean that their lives are infinitely valuable. Again, this is just an interpretation, and we know that their lives are not infinitely valuable because we see God valuing other people more than he values others. He definitely values prophets more than he values bad people, whatever, pick someone. He definitely valued the Egyptians less than he valued the Jews during the time of Moses.
This seems self-evident to us now, but only because we have lived with this belief for so long.
We have lived with this belief that all men are created equal and have value, but we did not always have that value. You remember something called racism and slavery and all these other things, genocides, all these things that prove that people didn't value people. Forget infinitely, they didn't even value them enough to keep them alive. Didn't you start by saying that there were all these tragedies that happened in the world?
The far more natural belief is that the strong should subjugate the weak.
Actually, the far more natural belief is that we take care of the weak. That's why when you look at tribes, they take care of old people and children. Remember that saying, it takes a village to raise a child? That's how tribes used to operate back in the day. They operated with that certain type of mentality to try and get the tribe to operate. In fact, I'll give you an easy example. Today, everybody is locked up in their own houses where they'll have a fridge and they'll feed their family. Back in the day, in tribes, you would kill for the entire tribe because you didn't have fridges. There was no point of storing the meat. You just eat it. But because you can't eat a whole buck or whatever by yourself, you would give it to the rest of the people in your tribe, and in turn, the other people would give back something else that they created. It's not natural for human beings to subjugate each other. That's something that happened later. If you were to describe the human animal as an animal, of every type of animal, you would not call it a subjugating species. You would call it a pack animal. Human beings operate in packs, and in order to operate in packs, you can't just subjugate people. That's how most things start to fall in humanity. We've seen it over and over again. That's why even tyrants try to appeal to the people, because it's unnatural for people, or it's unnatural for human beings to subjugate themselves under someone who shows no favor to them whatsoever. That's not a real thing. That's some made up stuff. Again, he's coming from a distorted point of view, so I understand why he's starting with such a false premise.
Which is precisely what people did in nearly every society in all of history.
Well, if it's so natural, why were the slaves and all the people in bondage so uncomfortable under that? Why would they try to free themselves? Why were they in constant stress?
Only by recognizing the divine in others did we ever move beyond this amoral thinking toward the concern for human rights, democracy, and free enterprise that characterized the West.
What a dangerous thing to say, downplaying the freedom fighters from Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Zimbabwe, the whole of Africa, Mahatma Gandhi, the freedom fighters in Russia, the ones who wanted to see African civilizations run themselves at a time when in America there was segregation. To pretend that the West was this place that came up with the idea that all men are created equal and they just ran with that, when we know that they were still engaging in deep segregation while all these other nations, including Russia, which is not Western, was speaking up against that.
But Judeo-Christian religion alone didn't build our modern civilization. We also required Greek reason to teach us objective observation, that man has the capacity to search beyond revelation for answers. Greek reason brought us the notion of the natural law, the idea that we could discover the natural purpose, the telos, of everything in creation by looking to its character.
That's not unique to Greek. In fact, Jews did this as well, so I don't understand why pretending like Jews were these religious people who didn't have these concepts. I'm lost.
Human beings were created with the unique capacity to reason. Therefore, our telos was to reason. By investing reason with so much power, Greek thought became integral to the Western mission. Nowhere is this more perfectly expressed than in the American Revolution, in which the founding fathers took the best of the European Enlightenment, with its roots in Greek thought, and the best of Judeo-Christian practice, with its roots in the Bible, and melded them into a whole new political philosophy. Without Judeo-Christian values, we fall into scientific materialism, the belief that physical matter is the only reality, and therefore also fall into nihilism, the belief that life has no meaning, that we're merely stellar dust in a cold universe.
I actually give up. I have no idea what he's talking about. I am actually legitimately confused what he's talking about.
Without Greek reason, we fall into fanaticism, the belief that fundamentalist adherence to unprovable principles represents the only path toward meaning. The Soviet Union, Communist China, and other socialist tyrannies rejected faith and murdered 100 million people in the 20th century.
And as we all know, people who accepted faith never did anything wrong ever.
Much of the modern Muslim world has embraced faith, but rejected reason. It's noteworthy that when the Muslim world did embrace Greek reason from the 8th to the 14th centuries, it was a leading center for scientific advancement. So,
wow, so he actually does know this, but for some reason, earlier he said things that would go completely against this.
Again, we need both Jerusalem and Athens, revelation and reason. And yet many want to reject both. These people call themselves progressives. Ironically, they want to take us backwards to a time when man was governed neither by reason nor faith, but by feeling, and therefore back to a time of moral chaos and disorder, of feeling over fact.
Well, I'm not in the business of defending progressives, but the idea that there's no progressives who are religious or who depend on reason is ridiculous. But this whole video is ridiculous. Up until this point, we've gotten to the only people in the world who are reasonable were the Greeks, and the only people who practiced faith were the Jews. What?
It would be a fatal mistake to follow the progressives. Stick with Athens and Jerusalem. I'm Ben Shapiro, editor of The Daily Wire and author of The Right Side of History for Prager University.
wow, this video finished with him not even talking about the bad stuff they did, and I wondered how he was gonna explain it, because when the West did embrace all of the stuff, they still did terrible things. Does he not know about the British Empire? Does he not know about Germany? Does he not know about Italy and all the bad things they did in the 1900s? Does he not know about Belgian Congo? Does he not know about how the Germans killed the Khoi people? At what point are we supposed to take stuff like this seriously? This, by the way, this is what they mean when they say we have to teach people the real history. This thing here, this is not the real history. This is a distortion that almost no reasonable person, anyone with even a slightly critical mind, would be able to tear this video up into tiny little pieces. The religious angle as well is like, that's just weird, but hey, good luck.